as such with great pleasure. It is difficult for me to summarize what has transpired these past days. These words begin one of the most notable speeches ever given by a dictator. Delivered by Fidel Castro in 1994, his speech on U.S. wrongdoing was significant to proponents of communism and, more importantly, to the capitalist nation we live in. In order to understand why this is significant to us, though, you have to understand a little bit about who Fidel Castro is and his background, why he was giving this speech and what he said, and where he was speaking and to whom he was speaking. But first, who is Fidel Castro? Well, now the former president of Cuba, Castro has a reputation for being a dictator, a communist, and a Cuban revolutionary. His path to becoming all of these things began in 1945 at the University of Havana, where he studied law, actually. According to Sir Arthur Leicester Scott Coltman, who was the British ambassador to Cuba during the Cold War upheaval, and who had direct access to Castro, Castro was passionate about anti-imperialism and opposing the U.S. intervention in the Caribbean. So, at university, he joined the University Committee for the Independence of Puerto Rico and the Committee for Democracy in the Dominican Republic. After university, he became a prominent communist revolutionary. Castro served as the Prime Minister of Cuba from 1959 to 1976, and he was the President of Cuba from 1976 to 2008. This is a picture of Castro in the green uniform he's often seen in anytime he makes public appearances, actually. It's not decorated or anything like that, it's just a plain green uniform. Sorry. He also served as the Commander-in-Chief of Cuba's armed forces from 1959 to 1976, and he was the first Secretary of the Communist Party for Cuba, 1961 to 2011, so clearly he's very involved in the country. Ultimately, Castro led the Cuban Revolution, which ousted Batista in 1959 and allowed him to bring his political and military power to the forefront of Cuba. Politically a Marxist-Leninist, under him, the Republic of Cuba became a one-party socialist state. Industry and businesses were nationalized, and socialist reforms were spread throughout society. Now that you understand how Castro came into power, let's move on to why he's giving this speech on U.S. wrongdoing. Ultimately, he saw himself as the voice of the people. He was speaking on behalf of them, giving them a voice he thought they needed. And generally it's accepted he did speak for about 90% of Cuba, the working class, the underprivileged, that sort of thing. But specifically, this speech was a response to something that still affects Cuba's economy and working class today. It's the trade barricade that the U.S. placed on Cuba in the 1960s. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, successive U.S. administrations have employed tough measures against the country, including prolonged economic sanctions and designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. And the Council of Foreign Relations is a nonpartisan membership group, think tank, and publisher that keeps up with U.S. relations with other countries. Castro, in his speech specifically about the blockade, says, "The blockade practically became the focal point of this conference. Much has been said about the blockade, so not much needs to be added. But, in essence, what is the blockade? The blockade means not even an aspirin to soothe a headache, medication to save someone's life from cancer, or medicine to soothe someone's pain in the final phases of his life can be sold to Cuba." Delivered in the 36th year of the Cuban Revolution, this speech expressed strongly Castro's dislike and distrust of capitalism, and especially of the United States. He employs repetition, and sarcasm to drive this point home, and to point out that the United States is hypocritical. He says, "The champion of freedom and the champion of human rights orchestrated a dirty war against Nicaragua. The champion of liberty and the champion of human rights supported a corrupt government. And the champion of liberty and of human rights continues to intervene where they're not welcome. This champion, of course, is the United States." Now that you know what has inspired this speech, let's talk about where and to whom Castro was speaking. It was known as the First World Conference for Solidarity with Cuba. It took place in Havana in 1994. According to The Militant, a international socialist news weekly that's actually published in the United States and distributed elsewhere, The conference attracts solidarity organizations, trade unions, peasant organizations, and religious groups that have been working to end the U.S. orchestrated policy aimed at overturning the revolution in Cuba. Many of the people who attend, if not all, align themselves with Castro and his socialist ideals, and at this very first conference, there were people from over 100 countries attending. This is actually a picture from the second conference because it's become a continuing thing as the Cuban Revolution continues. So people from everywhere are gathering pretty much to support Cuba and oppose the United States. Teresa Gutierrez from Workers' World reports, when the First World Conference met in 1994, Cuba's economic freefall had touched bottom. At the same time, Washington tightened the blockade and the Cuban-American right wing in Miami stepped up its hostile acts. These counter-revolutionaries thought the end of the revolution was near. And so, at this meeting, people come together and they listened to Castro's words and took them as inspiration and hope that, that one day this trade barricade would end and prosperity would return to Cuba. So now that you know who Castro is, why he was giving his speech, and who he was speaking to, I hope you can see why it's kind of important to us. It's rallying people against the United States and against a policy that we've held for over 36 years. Ultimately, communists and anyone else who supports Cuba, they're returning to Castro's words for inspiration and using those to fuel their desire to end this barricade and oppose the United States.